This is some new technology for me that I'm giving a little bit of a shot, so hopefully you will be able to see these slides and hear my voice recording over it. This is an introductory lecture, really, on the topic of moving towards a national culture in the early part of the 19th century in America. I'm calling it Towards a National Culture, the American Scholar and the Hudson River School. So this is going to get you started with thinking about the development of American popular culture and giving you a little bit of a context of the time period as well. But before we do this, let's look at how we're defining culture, and you can see some definitions also on the front page of the weekly materials screen. Culture is a learned behavior in many ways. And so we'll look at a few definitions here. The training, development, and refinement of mind, tastes, and manners, the condition of being thus trained and refined, the intellectual side of civilization, the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior, products, or way of life of a particular society, people, or period, or the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought. So what we're really saying here is that culture is a set of ideas, customs, behaviors, products, the way people behave in a particular society, and also how these behavior patterns, these arts, beliefs, and institutions are transmitted. So culture is something that is learned. Raymond Williams, one of the pieces that you're reading from this week, wrote Culture is Ordinary in 1958, and he expands the definitions to discuss the fact that he believes culture is ordinary. That is the first fact. Every human society has its own shape, its own purposes, its own meanings. Every human society expresses these in institutions and in arts and learning. The making of a society is the finding of common meanings and directions, and its growth is an active debate and amendment under the pressures of experience, contact, and discovery writing themselves into the land. The growing society is there, yet it is also made and remade in every individual mind. So Williams is arguing, and you'll see this in his essay, that culture is not just refined and intellectual, but it's ordinary. It's for everyone. And you'll be able to see these distinctions as they develop in the 19th century through the reading of Lawrence Levine as well, where he's talking about high culture and low culture. And you'll see this a lot throughout the semester, this distinction between low culture or popular culture that is sometimes shunned by those who believe that culture needs to be more refined and elevated in order to be characterized as true culture. Levine argues in William Shakespeare in America, which you'll also be reading this week, culture is a process, not a fixed condition. It's the product of unremitting interaction between the past and the present, which is sort of interesting if you begin to think about it historically, that culture evolves over time and it constantly evolves because of this interaction between the past and the present. And then finally, another piece, I'm not having you read this piece by Williams, but it's another one he wrote called The Analysis of Culture in 1961. And I think it's really important to think about as historians. We can learn a great deal of the life of other places and times, but certain elements, it seems to me, will always be irrecoverable. The most difficult thing to get a hold of in studying any past period is this felt sense of the quality of life at a particular place and time. Culture, really. A sense of the ways in which the particular activities combined into a way of thinking and living. We tend to underestimate the extent to which the cultural tradition is not only a selection, but an interpretation. We see most past work through our own experience, without even making the effort to see it in something like its original terms. And that's what I really want you to make an effort to do over the course of this summer semester, is to make the effort to see past popular culture in its original terms. What analysis can do is not so much reverse this, returning a work to its period, as to make the interpretation conscious, by showing historical alternatives, to relate the interpretation to the particularly contemporary values on which it rests, and by exploring the real patterns of the work, confront us with the real nature of the choices we are making. So as you're reading this semester, think about the cultural items, objects, movements in the context of what they would have meant in their own time. Don't just look at a 21st century view of Barnum. Think about how Barnum's exhibits, his American museums, things we're going to address in week 2, were seen by the people who lived in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, were seen and understood. Another reading that you're going to tackle this week is a very short one. It's actually a speech, and it was made by the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1837. And the speech was made in front of Harvard University students, and it was called The American Scholar. And this is something that we're really tackling this week. Why was there a need in the 1830s for a particularly American culture? And Lawrence Levine addresses this a little bit in Highbrow, Lowbrow. The idea that Americans, long after they declared their political independence, retained a colonial mentality in matters of culture and intellect is a shrewd perception that deserves serious consideration. So if we fought the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, broke away from the British, built a new nation, formed a new government, wrote a new constitution adopted in 1789 with the new President George Washington, that as much as we had gained our political independence, even into the 1800s, the first decades of the 19th century, we were still very much dependent on Europe and Great Britain for our culture, for our reading, for our arts, for our literature, and for these intellectual ideas. And so there are some scholars and some people who are expressing in this era a need for a particularly American culture. And Emerson is one of the ones who does this. And Oliver Wendell Holmes actually calls this speech the American Declaration of Independence. And Emerson says, perhaps the time has already come when it ought to be and will be something else, when the sluggard intellect of this continent will look up from its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of independence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. The millions that are around us rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sore remains of foreign harvests. Actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. Who can doubt that poetry will revive and lead in a new age, as the star in the constellation harp, which now flames in our zenith, astronomers announce shall one day be the pole star for 1,000 years? He continues, we will walk on our own feet, we will work with our own hands, we will speak our own minds. The study of letters shall no longer be a name for pity, for doubt, and for sensual indulgence. The dread of man and the love of man shall be a wall of defense and a wreath of joy around all. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul which inspires all men. And so what Emerson is really looking for here is to move away from what America is becoming defined as in the world, as this arbiter of mechanical skill, this hotbed of industrialization, but wants to be known as a place where poetry and literature and art are possible, that Americans will walk on their own feet, work with their own hands, speak their own minds. And this is saying, speak their own minds separate from Europe, right? That you can't continue to feed Americans on foreign culture. We need to have a native culture here. And Emerson's not really the first one to express this, though. Even back in 1786, Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, wrote to her sister Elizabeth, the accounts you give me of singing your birds and the prattle of your children entertain me much. Do you know that European birds have not half the melody of ours, nor is their fruit half so sweet, or their flowers half so fragrant, or their manners half so pure, or their people half so virtuous? But keep this to yourself, or I shall be thought more than half deficient in understanding and taste. I will not dispute what every person must assent to, that the fine arts, manufactories, and agriculture have arrived to a great degree of maturity and perfection. But what is their age? What their individual riches when compared with us? Far removed from my mind may the national prejudice be of conceiving all that is good and excellent comprised within the narrow compass of the United States. The universal parent has dispensed his blessings throughout all creation, and though to some he hath given a more goodly heritage than others, we have reason to believe that a general order and harmony is maintained by apportioning each to their proper station. Though seas, mountains, and rivers are geographical boundaries, they contract not the benevolence and goodwill of the liberal mind, which can extend itself beyond the limits of country and kindred, and claim fellowship with the Christian, Jew, or Turk. The first part of this is really interesting. In that you have Abigail Adams really singing the praises of an American culture and way of life that's distinct from Europe, and also alluding to the fact that common cultural taste, particularly for high cultural materials, really tended towards Europe. Emerson celebrates this potential for artistic growth and innovation beyond the technological, and at the same time, the poet Walt Whitman celebrated the particular genius of the United States as its people. That's where the culture is derived from, and this addresses your fourth reading for the week. His preface to the 1855 edition of his poetry, Leaves of Grass. Other states indicate themselves in their deputies, but the genius of the United States is not best or most in its executive or legislatures, nor in its ambassadors or authors or colleges or churches or parlors, nor even in its newspapers or inventors, but always most in the common people. Their manners, speech, dress, friendships, the freshness and candor of their physiognomy, the picturesque looseness of their carriage, their deathless attachment to freedom, their aversion to anything soft or mean, the air they have of persons who never knew how it felt to stand in the presence of superiors, the fluency of their speech, their delight in music, the sure symptom of manly tenderness and native elegance in the soul. For Whitman, America's culture rests in the beauty and unique qualities of America's people. And so using these readings and definitions as a starting point, we're going to move into a discussion of American culture and what that meant in the antebellum period. In antebellum, if you've forgotten or not known what that meant, it just means the period of American history before the Civil War. Benjamin Franklin wrote his autobiography in 1793, actually wrote it for his son William, who was the governor of New Jersey. The private life of the late Benjamin Franklin, originally written by himself. It's full of anecdotes and Franklinisms, but what it really talks about is something that becomes a particularly American notion, is this idea of the self-made man. And that's what Franklin is, and this becomes really an essential part of American culture. This idea that you can move up by your own bootstraps, your own intellect. It's not your birthright. It's not because of the family you were born into. It's the life in many ways you choose and after the revolution might have an opportunity to lead. You also see in this time period that there's very much a rise in the popularity of portrait painting among the middle and upper classes. To get your likeness painted is really a sign of culture and refinement. And you can see here a Charles Willson Beale, John Beale Bordley painting from 1770, Edward Savage's portrait of the Washington family done in 1789, which is really kind of interesting because you can see George and Martha Washington, their children, sitting before a map of the District of Columbia, the new capital of the United States, but also what's a part of Washington's family culture, in addition to these sort of Enlightenment practices, is the family slave standing in the background, and slavery is very much a part of American culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. People often got their portraits painted in their best dresses, with an object that represented something that they did, like you see Eliza Ridgely, the lady with the harp here. You also see cheaper portraits painted by itinerant painters, like this family of Azariah Caverly in New York in 1836, and we can see this representation of middle-class family life. You can see the father is reading a newspaper. There's very much a culture of reading in the 19th century. You can see the wife and the child and the objects of their wealth, the picture, the flowers, the rug on the parlor. We know that this family is decidedly middle class.